One question, two views. You decide.
Okay, so here's the big question for today. We know that the later parts of the Sumerian King List, the more recent kings, are pretty darn accurate. We can check them against other records. So, what does that tell us about the early parts? You know, the sections with kings who supposedly reigned for thousands of years. Does the later accuracy make the early stuff more believable? View 1 is going to argue yes, it absolutely does. It shows the compiler was trustworthy. But View 2 will say, nope, not at all. Being accurate when you have to be doesn't mean you're not making things up when you can get away with it.
To really get to the bottom of this, we're going to look at it from 3 different angles. First, we'll dig into the compiler's actual method. Then we'll talk about what it means when we find outside proof. And finally, we'll ask if this thing is even a single unified text to begin with. Ready? Let's get into it.
All right, first up, the compiler's method. This is all about the person or people who actually put this list together. Were they consistent in how they did their job from start to finish?
So what this really boils down to is this. Did the scribe follow the same rules when writing about the mythical, ancient kings as they did for the later, more historical ones? Or did their whole approach change based on the kind of information they had in front of them? Okay, so View 1 says absolutely. The method was consistent. Look at the later sections. The scribe was super disciplined, carefully recording records, putting them in order, things we can actually verify. So the thinking is, if they applied that same level of care to the early sections, then those fantastic stories must be their best attempt at recording the oral traditions they had. But View 2 comes at this from a totally different angle. They argue that later accuracy doesn't prove a consistent method, it just proves the compiler had better sources. For them, the goal was always the same: create this idea of one single, unbroken line of kingship. So yeah, they were accurate where people could check their work. That makes them look credible. But in the early parts where there were no records to check, they were free to invent whatever they needed to fit their political story.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. View 1 looks at all the errors, the contradictions, the just plain weird stuff in the early list, and they have a fascinating take. They say a propagandist would have cleaned all that up to make a smooth story. A truly faithful scribe, though, would preserve the sources exactly as they found them, warts and all. So that messiness isn't a sign of fabrication, it's actually proof of an honest historian trying to preserve difficult material.
Let's shift gears to our second argument. This one's all about outside proof. What does it actually mean when we find a king from the list mentioned on some totally separate ancient artifact?
And here's the real tension. If we can prove a few little parts of the list are true, can we kinda give the rest of it the benefit of the doubt? Or does it just prove that the compiler knew which specific facts they absolutely had to get right to seem credible?
From the historical memory perspective, every single match is a huge victory. When we find an inscription mentioning a king from an early dynasty, like Enme-Baragzi, it proves the compiler wasn't just making things up. They had access to real, ancient records. It basically makes them a credible witness. And if they were honest about the stuff we can check, it's pretty reasonable to assume they were being honest about the stuff we can't. View 2, of course, flips this right on its head. They say that external proof just shows us where the compiler's hands were tied. For later kings, there were tons of records, so they had to be accurate. For the early kings, sources were super rare. So a clever writer could just take 1 or 2 genuinely old, verifiable names and use them as anchors for their otherwise fabricated story. It gives the whole thing a veneer of authenticity while leaving them free to invent the rest.
And this is where View 2 really brings out the receipts, so to speak. When you actually crunch the numbers for those early kings, we're talking before the Akkadian Empire, we can only find independent external proof for about 10% of them. View 2 points to this and says, see, the vast majority of these names are ghosts. The compiler was clearly working with very, very little genuine material. This brings us to our third and final argument, which is all about the big picture. Are we looking at a single document written with one purpose? Or is it something else entirely?
So is this thing a single masterpiece created with one vision in mind? Or is it more like a living document that was edited, updated, and changed over generations for different political reasons?
View 1 argues that the list's super consistent structure, kingship comes down from heaven, it goes to one city, then the next, one king at a time, that points to a single organizing mind. Imagine the compiler's job, taking all these different competing local king lists and weaving them into one grand narrative. That sounds a lot like a historian trying to create order out of chaos, not a propagandist just inventing a story. View 2 counters that this so-called unity is just a really good editing job. They think the list was built in layers over many years. For instance, that whole section about kings who ruled before the Great Flood, it seems to be a later addition. It's not in the earliest versions. So the unity we see today is just the final coat of paint on a text that was reshaped again and again to make it look like all of history was leading up to whoever was in power at the time. And to back up V1's point, scholars have actually been able to identify what look like separate pre-existing source traditions that were all woven together to create the final list. You can see the fingerprints of distinct lists from powerful cities like Kish, Uruk, and Ur. The argument here is that the compiler's main job was this act of synchronization, carefully mixing these different traditions into a single timeline. This really paints the compiler as an organizer of tradition, not a creator of fiction.
Okay, so we've explored the three main battlegrounds in this debate: how the list was compiled, what outside proof really means, and whether the text is a unified whole. Let's just quickly run through that core question one more time. So we asked, if the later parts of the Sumerian King List are verifiably accurate, what does that imply about the early unverifiable parts? We looked at whether this suggests a consistent, reliable method was used throughout. We questioned if external proof makes the whole thing more trustworthy or just proves selective accuracy. And we asked if we're looking at a single composition or a text that was edited and reshaped over time for political reasons.
We've laid out how both sides see things, but as always, this channel doesn't take a position. Now it's over to you. What's your take? Does that later accuracy make you trust the scribes' work on the early mythical kings? Or you think it's just part of a very clever political construction? Let us know what you think in the comments. We'd love to hear it.